It doesn't mean you can't clean up when you make a mess. Okay? We're talking about occupational work. That's what we're talking about. Verse 15. Well, the word sheaf in verse 10, number 6016, it's the word omer. Omer. As bound up. You know, they cut a sheaf and then you tie a thing around it, you know, with a sheaf, you know, kind of like that hourglass shape to it, it's a sheaf. And what they would do, they would bring a sheaf, you know, bring it in on that first day, and then they would bring a sheaf every day after that, counting down until the wheat harvest. And then on the 50th day, which would be the day after the 7th completed Sabbath, that would be the day that you would offer then the first fruits of the wheat. Now, first fruits being Messiah, the barley, you know, in the spring at the Passover, he offered himself, right? The first fruit from the dead. And he was the first fruit of many brethren, which is then represented in the sheaf of the wheat harvest, known as at the Feast of Weeks. If you didn't count 7 complete weeks, we wouldn't call it the Feast of Shavuot or Feast of Weeks. If you didn't want to count weeks, we can change it and call it Pentecost, which you count in 50 days. Okay. But in verse 15, and you shall count for yourself from the day after the Shabbat, day after the Sabbath. That's the day that you brought the first fruit offering. From the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be completed, 7 complete weeks, what it's saying. And a Shabbat week is not from Tuesday to Monday. Shabbat week is from Shabbat to Shabbat, right? And it's those days in between. People recognize there is no name for any day in Hebrew of the week, except one, and that's called Shabbat, right? Everything else is given a number. Same way with years. He does everything from Shabbat to Shabbat. He does everything on the Sabbath year, the 7th year to the 7th year. You count 49 of those years, and then on the 50th one is the year of Jubilee. It's the same picture. When we apply the same reasoning and everything, we count 50 days. If you start counting on the day after Shabbat, which is the first day of the week, then the 50th day is always going to be on what? First day of the week. Can't help. Verse 16, count 50 days to the day after the 7th Shabbat. Then you shall offer a new grain offering to Yahweh. Now you realize that the Feast of Unleavened Bread is going to be on the 15th day of the month, which may not always be the same day of the week, right? But when you start counting, it's always going to be on the day following Shabbat. So no matter when the festival starts or ends, you're still counting 50 days from the day that you brought the grain offering, right? On the first day of the week. I did a teaching a while back, and it's talking about all the festivals. And when we look at the festivals and what they do, there's a teaching, and we've done it, we can talk about it maybe later on tonight if y'all want to, about the birth of a child, from conception to birth. And at every point in the conception of a child, from the time that the egg is released to be fertilized, from the time that the egg is fertilized and it implants itself in the womb and it travels down, and there's a certain period of time in there, kind of like this day that we talk about first fruit, you know, there's a period of time in there, if this thing's not fertilized within 7 days, it dies. But if it's, you know, conceived, then it has to travel down and implant, and then it goes through all the different things, and each one of the festivals is fulfilled completely, and each child is conceived and born, whether you ever realize it or not. In the birth of a child. It's kind of an interesting thought. Like I said, we can talk about it later, but in verse 17, uh-oh. In verse 17, you shall bring from your habitation 2 wave loaves, as implied, of 2/10 of an ephah. They shall be of fine flour. They shall be baked with leaven. These are made from wheat flour, not the flour of the barley harvest. They shall be baked with leaven. We've always been taught, you know, through Christianity that leaven represents sin, right? But leaven don't represent sin. Leaven represents doctrines. They can be false doctrines or they can be true. The unleavened bread, which is the true word of the Messiah, which he came to fulfill, is the pure word of Messiah. So we eat unleavened bread, the pure matzah, the pure bread of the Messiah. Not that's being corrupted. Remember, leaven means corruption. Because yeast and everything added into bread, when it begins to corrupt, begins to blow and to expand, and that corruption is what causes the increase in that bread. So what Messiah was saying, he said, beware of the what? The leaven of the Pharisees. He's saying, beware of the false doctrines. When we go through every year and get the leaven out of our house, what we're really saying to Yahweh is, I got the leaven out of my house, now I'm willing to get the false doctrines out of my life. That's what we're saying. A lot of people will buy books and give to people and everything. They say, well, I know there's some false doctrines in there, but it's got some truth too. Why don't you just read the scripture? Everything in it's true. You don't need anything else if you want true doctrine. You don't need all that other stuff. Verse 18, you shall offer with the bread 7 lambs of the first year without blemish, 1 young bull and 2 rams. They shall be as a burnt offering to Yahweh, with their grain offering and their drink offerings, an offering made by fire for a sweet aroma to Yahweh. Does he have a nose that he can smell that, or is it symbolic, referring to his pleasure with you doing what he said do? You see the concept? Let's don't think that he's up there like an awful lot of religions think about, you know, and they think that their God is actually eating whatever it was they killed. The whole thing in the picture of the scripture is that he is the sacrifice that you're making. And the sacrifice itself is a picture of what he's going to do, not what you're supposed to do for him. Big difference in those two concepts. Then you shall sacrifice 1 kid of the goats as a sin offering, and 2 male lambs of the first year as a sacrifice of peace offering. The priest shall wave them with the bread of the first fruits, a wave offering before Yahweh with the 2 lambs. They shall be holy, or set apart to Yahweh for the priest. They're set apart to Yahweh for the priest. He's not going to eat them. He's giving them to the priest. I don't know if we've ever really thought about that in those terms or those concepts, but that distinction helps us to separate all the other religions of the world from the creator of the universe and what he says, and get a hold of what he's really seeing in it. Verse 21, and you shall proclaim on the same day, it is a holy convocation to you. You shall do no customary work on it. It shall be a statute forever in all your dwellings throughout your generations. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field when you reap, nor shall you gather any gleaning from your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and for the stranger. Ani, Yahweh, your Elohim. You go out and cut the sheaf, you bind them up and bring them in, but what you drop, what falls, you know what falls, you leave it for the poor. You go back and look at what Boaz told his people. You know, and he told him to drop some deliberately for her. Why? Because he'd heard about this woman and what she does and how her righteousness had gone before her. And he has taken care of her. Do you reckon at the time he thought that, he knew he was going to be the kinsman redeemer? Because when she came down, you know, when he was on the threshing floor at night, and she crawled in and covered herself up with the hem of his garment, which is, by the way, where the fringe are, because that represents the kinsman redeemer. And she crawled underneath there, and he knew what she was saying. But he said there's another closer than that. Of course, it's really interesting the way he put that. Boy, he's a good lawyer. I mean, you talk about making words. He made it where he wasn't going to do it, but he actually became the kinsman redeemer. But all of these things, and these things that's in there, picture back against what the word says. And all these things are in the festivals and what they say about what he's going to come and do for us. If you'll notice now, we've just gone through Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, all the way up to Pentecost or Shavuot, right? And we know that Messiah's done those. When the Jewish people celebrate Shavuot every year, they're celebrating the giving of the Torah on that day. We can't go back, though, and count exactly and say that, well, when they came out of Egypt, then they counted 50 days and all this kind of stuff, because they didn't have the first fruit celebration in Egypt. They came out on the 15th. They traveled for 3 days. They went down through the Dead Sea, came up on the 17th, right? Kind of a picture of them being what? Us, Messiah being in the tomb 3 days and 3 nights, right? And he says if we were buried with him in baptism, then we're going to be raised up with him. Well, they all went down through the Red Sea, symbolic of all being baptized in the water. They were all under the cloud, which led them. Symbolic of us being under the Word, which is what leading us. The path that he made through the Red Sea, as the water stood up and formed a path, life for those who followed him. For those who came behind trying to kill his people, what? That same path became death. The word of life, the washing of the water of the word becomes a path through the world for you and leads you to him and life if you follow. If you don't, it's death. The same word that we enjoy that brings us life is death to those who won't receive it. Something in it, the same path that led them through the wilderness, through the Red Sea. Now as we get into the Feast of Trumpets here, most people call trumpets, Yom Teruah is the true name of the scripture. In verse 23, then Yahweh spoke to Moshe saying, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, in the 7th month is implied, the word in Hebrew is actually Kadosh, the 7th new moon. On the 1st of the month, Rishon, you shall have a Shabbaton, a memorial or a remembrance of blowing of shofars, a holy convocation. Now what is this remembrance of blowing a shofar? What are they supposed to remember? They blow the shofar now, you know, and the Jews do it 100 times in that day, but what is a memory? What are we supposed to remember? What are we remembering? Has anybody ever thought about what that says? So when, you know, or what are they remembering from the blowing of the shofar? What is the purpose of this day? Go back to Exodus. Goodness gracious. In Exodus 19, now if we start counting, you know, and we're counting the Omer right now, we're counting down to the Feast of Shavuot, so today we counted was 28, right? And we're going to be, you know, counting 50 days. We're actually talking about almost what, getting into 3 months from around the 14th to the 15th of the first month, right? So we're down in the, you know, 3rd month, say. Notice in Exodus 19 verse 1, in the 3rd month. What? Yeah, the 14th of Nisan to the middle of the next month, to the middle of the next month, you know, would be about what, 30? We're counting 50 days, so we're going to be somewhere in the 3rd month on the Hebrew calendar. Verse 1 in chapter 19, then the 3rd month after the children of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on the same day, or on that day, they came to the wilderness of Sinai. For they had departed from Ephidim, had come to the desert of Sinai and camped in the wilderness, so Israel camped there before the mountain. So it's approximately 50 days what we're looking at, okay? But nobody can make me believe that this actually says 50 days. It doesn't say that, but we know it's approximate. Verse 3, and Moshe went up to Elohim, and Yahweh called to him from the mountain, saying, thus you shall say to the house of Yaakov, and tell the children of Israel, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Is that literal or figurative? Figurative. Nobody ever saw a Jew hanging on an eagle's wing. Did they? I mean, I'm not trying to be facetious, but I'm trying to get us to understand there are figurative meanings of words and there are literal meanings of words. And in order to get the full understanding, we have to look at the context to get what the word really means. In verse 5, he says, now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. The purpose of him bringing them out is so he can give them his instructions and they can become a kingdom of priests for him. That's the purpose. If we join with his people, does he have a different purpose for us? No, it's the same one, isn't it? The same thing. He doesn't have different rules for different people. Everybody has the same purpose. But now in verse 9 it says, and Yahweh said to Moshe, behold, I come to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you and believe you forever. Verse 10, then Yahweh said to Moshe, go to the people and sanctify them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes, and let them be ready for the 3rd day. For on the 3rd day Yahweh will come down upon Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. Now when is the 50th day? You see, I just gave you a scenario that nobody can actually, exactly say. One day is, but it's pretty close. And the Jewish people celebrate on Shavuot the giving of the Torah. Okay? Verse 13, not a hand shall touch him, but he shall surely be stoned and shot. These are the people, if they go up on the mountain and pass the mark. Nobody can go up to him. He's going to come down to us, but you can't go to him. You can't go to him your way. He makes a way that he's going to come down to you, and he gives you a boundary. You stop, and he comes the rest of the way. Not a hand shall touch him, but he shall surely be stoned or shot, whether man or beast, he shall not live. When the trumpet, and that word trumpet is not shofar, the number is 3104. When the hayobel, or what we would call the sound of the Jubilee. Okay? When is the Jubilee year? Every 50 years. When Moses, not Moses, but when Yahweh was speaking to Noah, and he told him to go build an ark, and he said, yet, man shall be, 120 years before the death comes? If we've been on this earth ever since the creation of Adam now for around 6,000 years, if you divide that by 20, how many Jubilees is that? 6,000 divided by 50 is 120 Jubilees almost, right? At the end of the 6,000 years. So we've already gone through what? About 119 of them, so we got one Jubilee left to do, whenever that is, at the end of that 6,000. A lot of what I was saying, you'll get it later, and it'll all come back. We can talk about it some more. But notice there in verse 13, the last part, when the Yobel sounds long, they shall come. Most English Bibles have the word near the mountain. Actually, the Hebrew says they shall come up into the mountain when the shofar, the Yobel sounds. No, not here. Not in this one. Then in verse 14, Moshe went down from the mountain to the people and sanctified the people. They washed their clothes. He said to the people, be ready for the third day. Do not come near your wives. Then it came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunderings and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain and the sound of the shofar, 7782. This is the shofar that was blowing, and this is what he's talking about, a remembrance of. A thick cloud on the mountain, the sound of the shofar was very loud, so that all the people in the camp trembled. And Moshe brought the people out of the camp to meet with Yahweh, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. The foot of the mountain is the Hebrew idiomatic expression referring to under the chuppah. What is the chuppah? The marriage canopy. What do you do under the marriage canopy? You give your bride the ketubah, and you are betrothed. And then she goes away to learn how to live as a bride of a Hebrew man, studying her ketubah, her marriage contract, and he goes to prepare a place for her in his father's house. You know what Messiah did? And when he comes back, he's coming for a bride. Now, do you think he would want us to remember the day that the shofar, remember the day that I betrothed you to myself, and I'm coming back on Yom Kippur, Yom Teruah, the day of the awakening blast. That's what that word Yom Teruah means. Who's he going to wake up? Those who sleep in Messiah. But we shall not precede those who are dead. They shall what? The sound of the shofar, the last trump. What is the first trump? Last trump. Great trump. What are these terms? What is first trump? Shavuot. What is last trump? Yom Teruah. What is great trump? Yom Kippur. You see, understanding those terms then gives us an understanding of the festivals and what the scriptures are talking about. They stood at the foot of the mountain, or under the chuppah. Now Mount Sinai was completely in smoke because Yahweh descended upon it in fire. Its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace. The whole mountain quaked greatly. And when the blast of the shofar sounded long and became louder and louder, Moshe spoke, and Elohim answered him by voice. In the Talmud, and I'm not trying to say that the Talmud and all those kind of things are the only truth, but there's a lot of discussion in the Talmud going way back, and there's discussions in the Talmud concerning the passage that is talking about here when Moses, received the Torah, the word from Yahweh. The Talmud says, the voice of Yahweh came out and went down, and it was like a tongue of fire, and it went up into the ear of each person that heard it, and would speak all the commandments of Yahweh. When he'd ask, do you accept this? And the people would say, yeah. And remember, it was all over. It says that people went back and told him that we would do everything you said. Does that story sound kind of interesting to what we read about in the book of Acts? When they were all in the upper room celebrating Shavuot, and the word of Yahweh came in, the breath, the spirit, the word of what? Like tongues of fire that sat on each one of them that was in that upper room waiting. But it was only those that were in that room, 120 of them. kind of something to compare, think about. I'm not saying that's exactly the way it is, but it sure does sound interesting. Anyway, this is the blowing of the shofar. Now go back to Leviticus 23. You have a memorial, a remembrance of blowing of shofars. That's a holy convocation. What else does he tell us to do on this day? You shall do no customary work on it. You shall offer an offering made by fire to Yahweh. So what do we do on that day? Yeah, we get together, we have a holy convocation, we have an assembly, we come together, you know, and we eat and have a good time like we always do. And then we blow the shofar, and we blow it sometimes 100 times that day, right? But we can't ever, you know, we can't forget that what we're really doing is remembering that shofar that was blown. Because that was the call to betrothal. When you pick up and drink the cup at the Passover, right? Didn't Messiah say this is a new covenant? The new what? Disposition of sin in my blood, he said. And it's through that is how we were betrothed to him. And he's coming back for a perfect bride. You never get all these things if you don't celebrate the festivals and study them and learn what they mean. You're never going to get these kind of things concerning Yahweh if you start trying to do Easter and Christmas and all them pagan things. You don't ever get any of that kind of truth. Okay. An awakening blast. Word trumpets itself, 8643, and memorial there, the word memorial is 2146.